that we.
So thanks everyone. Yeah, these days can be quite long, can't they? With so many talks, but it's been great. So we've got one final talk just before. So that we're all going to dinner at 7 p.m. at a place in Bloomsbury. Everyone's welcome. Before, because we'll be finished here at 5:10 now. There's a pub just here that we're going to go and have drinks and then go up to Bloomsbury. So you are more than welcome to come to the pub and then to the dinner, or go straight to the dinner. Anyway, think about that for the next hour and listen to what I'm sure will be great is
Thank you very much, Rivka, and thank you very much, everybody. It's been a great day. This is the Graveyard Shift. So I am grateful that you are here, and while I am no comedian, I am hoping that this time spent in conversation will make it worth everyone's while, and we can just keep the sleep from our eyes prior to the stimulants that we will find in the drinking establishment. I am neither the first nor will I be the last to discover that no matter how carefully one has thought about the abstract as part of planning one's presentation, the actual process of what Peter Knight characterizes as writing to think, at the top there, has a salutary impact on what the same author characterizes as a tripartite process in which claims making takes place on the basis of sense making, which he takes from Veik, 1995. Now, race itself has occupied a less central place in philosophical discourse of communities working in medicine than has been the case in other disciplinary arenas, not least, for example, history of medicine. So I have decided to take the opportunity to share some of the sense making in which I've been engaging both recently and over a much longer period. And as a consequence, the processes of claims making will remain unfinished. This is work in progress. Hoping that this presentation will not simply offer propositional content about social justice, but that it will both constitute and enact social justice. To that end, it is imperative that one works with traditions that are understood to be philosophically canonical, or should that be canonically philosophical, whilst also acknowledging some of the ways in which the practices of philosophy itself are emblematic of the problems that this very workshop is addressing. Please understand this paper as an act of resistance. Some of the questions motivating this work include the following. To what extent is the medicalizing of race, per se, helpful to understanding the medicalizing of Blackness more specifically? To what extent are the problems of pain in medicine across ethno-racial identities responsible for what are taken to be the specific challenges of pain as experienced by Black people? Precisely what is the understanding of Black in health research? To what extent do people only become Black in the context of the diaspora? And do the same or similar expressions of pain in medicine obtain outside the West? Given the depth of challenge to the intuitive notion that pain is necessarily a matter of perception as opposed to introspection, notwithstanding that some might argue that the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, to what extent do philosophical approaches to thinking about pain potentially contribute to emancipatory approaches to improving pain management in medicine? And to what extent do they reinforce the lack of anthropological equity? This word is not particularly important and is not a synonym for equality in pain management. In relation to the above, is there an argument that metaphysical concepts of pain are potentially undermined by accounts of pain that elude intuitionist accounts of pain? Put differently, to what extent are analogical and non-analogical references to psychological pain, technical terms here include agopsycholia and psychologia, or even psychogenic pain, dependent on what philosophers of pain characterize as the perceptual stroke representational theory, PRT, of pain? Nicola Grahek coming later, although not in huge detail. What can and do historical approaches tell us about how pain has traditionally been understood in Western medicine, and enable us to understand the conditions that have resulted in this having become a conversation in 2024? To what extent can this discursive arena be further enlightened and enlivened through the disciplinary frameworks of anthropology and cognate, including philosophical anthropology, taken by Lewis Gordon, the Black American philosopher, as, or the Black American philosopher, as intrinsic to both Black and Africana philosophies, and ethics, where one very important question is that of whether or not classical virtue ethics and or situationism actually take race seriously. These questions are, of course, focused on that which comes after the colon in my title. Deeper engagement with them will have to wait. Right now, let's begin with two postulates that we will unfurl into what might be understood as the starting point proper of this paper. The first postulate holds that Jacques Derrida is a dead white French philosopher whose ideas should be discarded in the quest for something rather more emancipatory. One set of calumnies is perpetrated when white academics take that as a truism. Entirely another set is perpetrated when those who do not identify as white, therefore including Black, also take this as a truism. Within philosophy, controversy, of course, continues to rage over whether or not Derrida should even be regarded as any sort of philosopher, but that rabbit hole is not our concern or set of rabbit holes right now. Here, we are simply identifying the fact that there are several reasons why Derrida is not widely understood as a player in social justice conversations. While it seems unlikely that no one in this conversation will not know this, in the interests of non-ambiguity, I hereby state categorically for the record that as an Algerian-born Jew, there is no meaningful sense, more on this later, in which Derrida can be legitimately classified as white. The second postulate has rather less proponents, but is offered as an example of the kind of ways in which the Academic Philosophy Guild tends to moderate epistemic possibilities within this discipline. It holds that when Jean-Paul Sartre is discussing bad faith, mauvais foi, there is no sense in which his use of faith can be understood as having any relationship whatsoever with the word concept faith, as it is used in either religious epistemology or epistemology more broadly. To suggest that there may be such a relationship is a manifestation of philosophical naivete, and there are few disciplines in which one would want to more assiduously avoid the charge of naivete. Whilst trying very carefully to not abuse Wittgenstein, the default position appears to be that there is no possible way in which the language game being deployed by Sartre can possibly have anything to do with the legitimate concerns of pistology, which is a recent rubric based on the Greek word that we translate as faith, that now serves in some quarters as the term for the philosophical investigation of faith as phenomenon. Working on the aforementioned basis that for some thinkers these postulates can only be truisms, let's now take another sideways step towards an actual postulate that will remain as a postulate. It is the first governing conviction upon which this paper stands. The enterprise we know as critical race theory, hereafter CRT, has come a very long way from its origins, and at present seems to have become a referent for a very undistinguished aggregation of all sorts of positionalities, more and more of which, not least as they are espoused here in the UK, seem to depend solely on secondary sources for their existence. Having become more of a political battle axe than a credible academic enterprise that forces interlocutors to confront the weaknesses of theoretical endeavor, but fail to take the consequences of racialized and racist thinking seriously, not only in the context of how these are applied in practices, part of what is being argued here is that CRT itself is increasingly emblematic of bad faith. And if it is to play any part in the rejuvenation of clinical care within medicine that results in increased health equity, a very significant rehabilitation of this enterprise is required. With these two truisms and one postulate in hand, let us now shift the perspectival lens for a moment. As Devakumar et al. Have noted, race itself has become a public health crisis that can no longer be ignored. But perhaps it is worth the time it takes to point out that this assertion comes over a quarter of a century after the Caribbean Harvard professor David Williams and his team promulgated what they characterized as the Everyday Discrimination Scale, EDS for short. At this moment, one needs to know that public health orthodoxy had long maintained that irrespective of one's ethno-racial identity, the further one was up the socioeconomic spectrum, the better one's health outcomes, not least because one would have more access to better healthcare. Williams and his colleagues, in fact, showed with empirically demonstrable rigor that for those self-identifying as Black in North America, irrespective of whatever position they held on the socioeconomic spectrum, this constituency experiences significantly worsened health and healthcare. This news arrived as a bomb on that continent, but it would not be until the end of the second decade of this century that the NHS on this side of the pond decided that we should be taking these research findings more seriously in relation to the remarkably similar situation in this part of the English-speaking West. One may now reasonably ask, what either of the first two truisms have to do with what is just being discussed right now? And there is a sense in which the answer on the surface is almost nothing. If, however, one is less interested in the surface, then things get rather more interested by virtue of being rather more complicated. But I now need to make use of another actual truism, and this time it is the fact that Derrida can only be French instead of Algerian by virtue of French colonial expansion. But one of the mangled consequences of simply assuming the facticity of Derrida's French identity arises at the moment we try to make sense of the fact that Derrida does not receive the rights of a French citizen at the moment he is expelled from his secondary school due to the anti-Semitic policies of the Vichy administration. Irony may not be quite the right word for the fact that Derrida is frequently assumed to be part of that which we are increasingly encouraged to disavow in certain quarters. White, male, cisgender, heterosexual, and, for good measure, now dead. When in fact, apart from the dead bit, it is not only that this is not true, but the possibility of its being true cannot exist by definition. And I'm, of course, speaking specifically about Derrida's whiteness. However, the fact that people of many different ethno-racial identities make this mistake for reasons that we might legitimately assume are benchmarked by our understanding of Derrida's notional national identity as French is now being identified as emblematic of another aspect of what Sartre had in mind with the concept of mauvaise foi. It is only possible to assert Derrida's whiteness as an act of faith, and now I wish to identify one popular definition of faith that is supposed to be credible. Believing that which one knows is not true. The idea is not to suggest that to believe Derrida is white is in actual fact to believe that which one categorically knows is not true. But there is some, albeit short-scale, epistemology taking place here. And it involves Derrida's historical proximity to other French post-war thinkers and the ways in which certain academic constituencies within the English-speaking West assume a homogeneity across this entire spectrum of thought. And while that notion is entirely problematic, this entire constituency of French thinkers is, of course, entirely white, with pretty much the sole exceptions of Jacques Derrida and Hélène Cixous, both of whom are in fact Algerian Jews, whilst being globally understood as being French, despite experiencing rejection by and from France. So, trying to not make the kind of reprehensible argument that simplifies and reduces, I'll move to the first person and hereby suggest some of the ways in which I take racial justice advocacy to take place within medicine and beyond, and the fact that these might do well to consider some of the ways in which Derrida and Cixous navigated the realities of being French, well, Cixous still alive, French and non-French, in order to reclaim ownership of their own epistemic identities through epistemological lenses of their own choosing. Now, perhaps there is no more hotly debated aspect of Sartre's bad faith thesis than the role of freedom in this epistemic claim. Part of the mechanism that undergirds this section of the paper is the conviction that one need not cancel Sartre as a dead white male cisgender European, because there is much that can be learned from him. But there's also a sense in which those of us who do not self-identify as white need to develop the capacity to develop our own epistemic authority. I will shortly take up an argument against CRT that echoes many of my own concerns with this enterprise. But before we get to that, I am making a quick-fire connection between Sartre's bad faith and Lewis Gordon's theory in Black, if only we had more time, and suggesting that if we Black people are to experience better outcomes as ethno-racially minoritized people in medical healthcare in the West and North, etc., we will need to become significantly better at advancing arguments for the importance of taking the concerns of our lived experiences seriously, and to that end, we will need something that is foreshadowed by the concept of theory in Black, which actually qualifies a theoretical endeavor in ways that, at present, CRT does not. To begin the process of clarifying, CRT is being presented here by its exponents as having the capacity to achieve what biomedical and SDOH curricula, more on that later, social determinants of health, cannot. Rigorously teach physician trainees how to combat health inequity. I hereby begin the process of showing that there are structural weaknesses in CRT itself, which severely undermine the processes of advocating for it. It is epistemically dependent on more of what it disavows than its proponents appear to have realized. An analog that may help some of us understand this differently would be the UCL geneticist Adam Rutherford's 2020 publication, How to Argue with a Racist, in which the author makes two moves of relevance to this argument. First, Rutherford presents this book as a weapon, constituting the scientific tools necessary to tackle questions on race, genes, and ancestry. The definite article is entirely problematic. Second, in the preface to the paperback edition, he tells us that he intends to show that although historically, science has been misused to institutionalize racism, today, science is no ally to racists. Science can and should be deployed as an anti-racist tool. However, if racism is a pernicious enterprise of both thought and action that is and has always been morally and ethically contemptible, then at the moment science both co-creates the concept of race itself and facilitates rationales for racism, the epistemic mechanisms that enable a person to not only know, but also understand, we should do some Greek here, but we don't have time, that they are not inferior, cannot be found within science, which means that any more recent claim on behalf of science as a weapon against anti-racism can only take place on an approach to science that takes a very different ethical standpoint to that taken by Francis Galton et al. It should now be clear at this moment that it is not, in fact, science which makes a difference, but something else. Ethics, theology, anti-racist moral philosophy. Hang on, does that exist? Don't answer that. And even anthropology, the history of which Rutherford has unfortunately not understood properly, not least in relation to its role in causes of anti-racism. Now, in the interest of fairness, it should be noted that there is much to admire in this publication, but none of that can change the fact that in relation to the two rhetorical moves identified herewith, this is a bad faith argument, and part of this is so precisely because that is exactly not what Rutherford intended. So let's go back to Tsai, Lindo, and Bridges, who begin their 2021 paper by elucidating the shortcomings in the pedagogic approaches in contemporary biomedical and social determinants of health curricula used in their discussion of health disparities. In particular, current medical pedagogy lacks self-reflexivity, encodes social identities like race and gender as essential risk factors, neglects to examine root causes of health inequity, and fails to teach learners how to challenge injustice. In contrast, we argue that critical race theory is a theoretical framework uniquely adept at addressing these concerns. It offers needed interdisciplinary perspectives that teach learners how to abolish, biological racism, leverage historical contexts of oppression to inform interventions, center the scholarship of the marginalized, and understand the institutional mechanisms and ubiquity of racism. In sum, CRT does, these folks claim, what biomedical and SDOH, social determinants of health, curricula cannot: rigorously teach physician trainees how to combat health inequity. Does it, though? Is it actually possible? Can biological racism ever be abolished? Robert Romero, a deeply committed proponent of CRT, tells us that CRT represents a diverse body of theory and reflection, and I, he says, do not agree with it all. For that matter, not all CRT theorists and practitioners agree with each other. An immediate example of this comes, although not ostensibly and not as he intended, with the next two sentences, which read as follows. As a valid critique of CRT, my co-author, Jeff Liu, points out that CRT largely lacks a hopeful eschatological vision of the beloved community of all. I agree, Romero says, and I believe, along with Jeff, that the addition of such an overarching theological vision could be a significant Christian contribution to CRT. Now, Romero goes on to note that the intellectual father figure of CRT is the late Derek Bell. We don't talk about him at all in the UK, which is a serious problem. But there is no discussion about the fact that Bell is known to have also had a very serious commitment to his Christian faith, as well as being fundamentally opposed to any talk of a post-racial society. While an adequate understanding of Bell's position requires more time than we have, eschatology is a very theological word concept, and certain Christian communities take it to be linked to the question of future hope. The point is not that Bell did not have a version of the hope that is taken to be indispensable to Christianity, but that his understanding of eschatology did not manifest itself in a way that Romero and Leo have chosen to understand. Now, of course, hope is obviously not paradigmatically unique to Christianity by any means. But in much the same way that Romero and Leo believe that CRT would be better if it pointed to hope, Sy, Lindo, and Bridges can only be leveraging hope, and I argue faith as well, in committing to the idea that CRT will necessarily achieve all that they have said it will in the barest handful of paragraphs. And now, of course, we have a connection to the second of our two opening truisms. However, back in 2008, Trevino, Harrison, Walker characterized CRT as a burgeoning and widely recognized critical emancipatory program before going on to say that despite its important analytical and activist breakthroughs in rooting out racial injustice, we argue that CRT needs to sharpen its critical edge. In order to do so, it must confront and resolve the three problems of the rule of law, theory, and colorism. Now, all three of those problems are in principle of considerable interest to this conversation. A problem is that their argument in the end will struggle to withstand philosophical scrutiny. Notwithstanding, Trevino, Harrison, Walker have still posed plenty of intractable problems for not only Romero and Leo, and Sy, Lindo, and Bridges, but many other CRT exponents in relation to what they identify as the problem of theory. Trevino et al. Tell us that CRT has many rigorous concepts and methods, but these have not been coherently integrated in a way that would give CRT the systematic structure, the intellectual architecture that is representative and in fact required of most social theory. What we frequently get with CRT is not a unified theory, but a loose hodgepodge of analytic tools that are frequently used in a catch-as-catch-can manner. Additionally, while CRT does possess several basic tenets or theses, e.g. the normality of racism thesis, the social construction thesis, the differential racialization thesis, the voice of color thesis, these do not constitute a fundamental set of beliefs on which all crits agree. Not sure about the word crits, but we know what they mean. If you don't, ask in the Q&A. What we see here characterized as the voice of color thesis refers to CRT's emphasis on the importance of privileging the work and ideas of scholars of color. However, in yet another small twist to the way certain matters are often understood and narrated, the founding father of Black theology, James Cone, made the decision to disavow the white and German theologian Karl Barth for what appears to be no other reason than the fact that as a white man, there is no project and no set of values that Barth could undertake and hold that would be of any relevance to the liberating of Black lives. Hopefully it now makes sense to somebody in this room and online when I put my finger on the fact that the way in which it is so easy for Derrida's ethno-racial identity to be misrepresented by scholars from either the so-called global South or one of the diasporas is not merely one of those things. One postgraduate student back in the day in management studies at the University of York showed quite emphatically at the point of writing that Derrida was consistently and comprehensively misread by many management scholars, undertaking a very effective critique of Habermas's reading of Derrida in the process and showing some of the flaws in the general argument that Derrida's work cannot be used for bona fide emancipatory purposes. Why would this be so? In a 2023 paper, Borner Hess argues that Derrida has been fundamentally misread as thinking and writing exclusively in a white Western idiom and addresses and investigates Derrida's infrequent claim that his approach to deconstruction was always focused on racism and Eurocentrism. something that would not be used to many of those genuinely familiar with Derrida's 1971 paper, White Mythologies. However, in a rhetorical move that is also genuinely hermeneutic, Hess argues, in accordance with both what he characterizes as the racial logic of expulsion and what has already been stated in this paper, that Derrida was expelled from French citizenship and from the French school. But if we examine the logic of the anti-Semitic racial laws of the Nazis, that logic points to a foundation logic, which was the expulsion from whiteness. Under the Nazi configuration of race laws, whether inflected through the use of Aryanism or Nordicism, Jews, as the antithetical race, were rendered non-white. There is a huge amount to say about all of this that has to be left for now, but this part of the argument now holds that we need to understand the concept of biological racism solely in the terms assumed by Adam Rutherford's previously referenced conversation, where Black theologians assume that Karl Barth's whiteness automatically precludes his ability to contribute to the cause of Black emancipation. Barth was discriminated against for no other reason than his phenotypical identity, and we might genuinely and laterally see that as a form of biological racism. And where Derrida is cast as not only French, but also of a type of intellectual that upholds the patriarchal and colonial oppressions of the West, he literally experiences a type of racialist double jeopardy that also exemplifies biological racism. There's, of course, not enough time to unpack this in ways that would be ideal, but the argument now returns to the second truism identified at the beginning of this paper, and contends that these positions genuinely cannot be sustained without an actual doxastic element, the actuality of belief in the context of faith. To understand the relevance, one needs to know that for the past few decades, the dominant position in analytic philosophy of religion that focuses on so-called religious epistemology, which is a WASP enterprise at present, led by the two Daniels, Daniel Howard Snyder and Daniel McCoyne, categorically insists on a non-doxastic account of faith, i.e., belief should not be understood as being epistemologically, not epistemically necessary to faith. Now, one can make the sidestep to suggest that this would now allow a defense of, for example, excusing structurally and ostensibly racist actions on the grounds that they could not be taken as indicative of a fundamental and normative commitment to racism that would require the attitude, or perhaps better, proposition attitude of belief. And at this moment, one might reasonably be taken to be standing on the shoulders of Bertrand Russell and his work in philosophy of mind. Now, this is, of course, is not abstract speculation. Virginia and Black was a landmark decision of the Supreme Court of the United States, in which the court held 5-4 that any state statutes banning cross-burning on the basis that it constitutes prima facie evidence of intent to intimidate is a violation of the First Amendment to the Constitution. Such a provision, the court argued, blurs the distinction between prescribable threats of intimidation and the Ku Klux Klan's, would you believe it, protected messages of shared ideology. In this case, 3 defendants were convicted in 2 separate cases of violating a Virginia statute against cross-burning. However, cross-burning can be a criminal offense if the intent to intimidate is proven. This would not be achieved, and as such, those convictions and several others were subsequently overturned. We now turn to the specific use that the African-American philosopher Julius Bailey has made of Sartre's concept of bad faith. In the era of Trump, the term bad faith has become a ubiquitous descriptor of what John Herman at the New York Times has called a political moment marked by mendacity and duplicity and engineered confusion. But if the ubiquitous modern usage of the term has deprived of its accusatory power, the philosophical concept of bad faith remains unquestionably and profoundly relevant to the current moment's many political hypocrisies and raises important questions about how we might more productively call them out. So I'll take the risk, given that the strategy is working recently very well, of hoping that somebody will ask me to talk in more detail about exactly how Julius Bailey is reading Sartre at this moment. Because let's spend a little bit of time, or rather a little bit more time, with the medical aspects of this conversation before I close this down. Thank you for still being here. This part of the conversation builds on work that was presented to the 2023 IHPS, that's the Integrated History and Philosophy of Science Conference in Durham, in which I proposed that the cardinally important IHPS disciplinary purview be modified slightly to IHPSM, thus including medicine. This would highlight the need to consider the interrelationship between science and medicine, as well as ways in which both history and philosophy can co-produce ways of thinking that would not otherwise exist. So on the historical side, Stephen Muir-Veal follows Mark Jackson in noting that what historians of medicine focus on is not simply the question of whether and how knowledge is socially and culturally constituted, but rather whether historical research can and should extract lessons from the past for the health problems that we face today. In other words, the lack of communication between historians of science and historians of medicine seems to stem from the fact that the former tend to be interested in the questions of epistemology, whereas the latter care more about questions that are ethical and political in nature. Now, Muir-Veal develops his argument by returning to Ludwig Fleck, whose 1935 publication, Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact, is known to have had a direct influence on Thomas Kuhn. Muir-Veal, however, is more interested in presenting what becomes an amalgam of ideas from two lesser-known writings, essays from 36 and 39 in The Problem of Cognition, where Fleck claimed that any epistemology that wanted to avoid the fundamental error of hypostasizing a symbolic epistemological object had to acknowledge three basic phenomena. Number one, the collective mental differentiation of persons. Number two, the fact that the circulation of thought is always related, in principle, to its transformation. And number three, the existence of a specific historical development of thinking, which cannot be reduced to the logical development of thought contents, nor to simple increase of detailed information. Hopefully somebody is seeing an implicit critique of CRT hiding here in Fleck. Let us tie these postulations to a quote from what at the time of Muir-Veal's chapter was still an unpublished essay from 1939 entitled Science and Its Environment, in which Fleck argued that it was once thought that science would make that mysterious and intricate complex called nature somehow easier and simple to grasp for the mind. Instead, science has become the structure, which as a whole is not at all simpler from nature, but which is much harder to attain. It is easier to find one's way in the woods than in botany. It is also easier to cure a patient than to know what he is really suffering from. Muir-Veal is, of course, clear on the fact that Fleck is discussing science rather than medicine and making the point that science does not proceed from common sense, but rather goes against and eventually overcomes common sense. But I read this quote, and particularly the last sentence, as bridging the gap from science into medicine, not least because in typical common sense processing, both race and pain are symbolic epistemic objects that raise structurally important epistemological issues with historical dimensions. Now, some of you will know this groundbreaking study of sickle cell disease in Memphis, Tennessee. Keith Wayloo argues, or not argues, tells us that in the 1850s, Southern physician Samuel Cartwright invented dysesthesia aethiopicus, a disorder that he claimed caused obtuse sensibility of the body and insensitivity to pain when subjected to punishment in slaves, or better, enslaved persons. But I'm quoting Wayloo. The disease is a convenient invention, for it could be used to highlight just how different enslaved Black people were from their white owners. Biological difference could be used to excuse plantation whippings and to explain the excessive brutality of slavery. Now, Wayloo's argument in this particular narrative is specific to sickle cell anemia as opposed to pain more broadly, but those who know either Black and Asian people suffering with sickle cell or Greek Cypriot or Cypriot Greek people suffering from thalassemia will likely know that pain is central to the lived experience of the vast majority of those living with such diagnoses. Much of the important work that Wayloo achieves herein involves his making connections across rubrics such as Black pathology, Black disease, and racial disease. But it will be 13 years before Wayloo publishes what he characterizes as a political history of pain beyond not only the specificity of sickle cell disease, and indeed hemoglobinopathy in general, but also race. It's an argument that makes some deeply astute and creative connections between the specific US drug epidemic of the 90s and noughties and what Christian Zenartu, writing in 2019, characterized as not just an epidemic of painkillers, but an epidemic of pain. Ends in sight. I am, of course, assuming that in a room such as this, representing communities across philosophy, medicine, and more, there will be no need to remind anybody that the semantic fright of all lives matter is essentially meaningless within the two most immediately accessible frameworks of meaning. As a statement offered without qualifications or caveats, it expresses what many, albeit not all, take to be ipso facto, or perhaps better, de facto. However, the legal origins of de facto are particularly relevant to this conversation, given that the importance, and here against Peter Singer, I would like to use the word sanctity, of human life is arguably more widely accepted as de jure than de facto. But when all lives matter is used as a rejoinder to Black Lives Matter, arguably the first point to be made is that if all lives really did matter, then why is the mortality rate for Black people right across the life course so much higher than for every other demographic? Hopefully it's clear. All lives matter is a humdinger bad faith sentiment. The people protesting in the streets know very well that the epithet all lives matter is only true de jure as an abstract concept in the realm of more emancipatory jurisprudence. It is not yet a de facto reality, which is a way of saying that all pain matters, of course, and not only in medicine, of course, but the pain that is experienced by Black people in medicine raises a veritable smorgasbord of questions, all of which are spaciously under-researched at this time of writing. At last year's Manchester Jazz Festival, I'm a jazz musician, I watched saxophonist Nathaniel Facey engage in one of the most remarkable instantiations of medical humanities I've ever witnessed. As he told the audience, saxophone in hand, about the death of the legendary jazz musician Eric Dolphy, who fell into a diabetic coma on tour in Germany, but failed to receive life-saving treatment because it was presumed that as a Black American jazz musician, he must have been a junkie. Joanna, I remember what you said yesterday earlier. And this was the point during the writing process when I realized that I was not going to be able to get to the type of philosophical discussion I'd hoped to include that involved, amongst other things, Nicola Grahek's feeling pain and being in pain. Just a tiny bit more to go. Thank you, everybody. Endorsed by Daniel Dennett. It is a very important work in philosophy of pain, but its argument raises several important questions, both in relation to the heuristic dimensions of Grahek's narrative, but also in relation to the extent to which philosophy of pain, as it is currently practiced, speaks to anybody apart from philosophers and scientists working within a specific vanguard of epistemic and epistemological presuppositions. If we were to imagine this very same title was for a book written from the disciplinary perspective of history, one could easily construct notional narrative possibilities for social and or cultural histories of pain with perhaps a wider level of conceptual nuance than a work like Harriet Washington's Medical Apartheid, which sadly, it turns out, is longer on assertion and shorter on argument, to my great frustration. It may even be possible to imagine a work with the title displaying general familiarity with either pure philosophical phenomenology or applied phenomenology, and as such asking some important questions about the trade between that which is in fact experienced and that which a given subject is taking to be what they are experiencing. Instead, seemingly motivated by the trajectory of work in analytic philosophy and cognitive science driven by John Searle, Daniel Dennett, and the Churchlands et al., Grahek is interested in what dissociation syndromes and pain experience teaches about the true nature and structure of human pain experience. To this end, Grahek privileges the empirical literature in order to drive a heuristic agenda that disavows what he characterizes as subjectivist and objectivist views of pain. So as far as Grahek is concerned, pain is a type of symbolic epistemological object to reflect nomenclature and with a sufficiently concrete identity that can be genuinely understood as a result of appropriate investigation. Christian Zenartu at one point held not dissimilar ideas. But this paper, or earlier referred to, is an explication of the way in which his position had to evolve as a consequence of what today we will call epistemic humility, in his own words. Last slide. Suffering is a force of its own. The dark matter of the universe melting underneath our picture-perfect lives. Suffering is constantly creeping under the untouched image of society we want to create. It pervasively affects the marginalized groups that our society does not want to see. There they are coming into your clinic, those who ache horribly from a backache, knee ache, or whole body ache. Those literally inconsolable beings, hoping that you can, just this once, please prescribe them an opioid that could overpower this pain, giving them normalcy and peace. Come on, doctor. Oxycodone 30 milligrams is the only one that works for me. How could I, Zamato asks, deal with this? How could I separate genuine from non-genuine pain? Who am I to make this distinction? This conversation isn't finished, but it is time to draw a line under this presentation and give us your very good selves. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Alex, do you have a mic?
Hello. Yeah, thanks. Thanks. That's really fascinating. I was wondering if you so drawing this connection between pain in the sort of philosophy of mind consciousness literature, and I guess so. I'm not sure how much you went into it. Pain as in the context of sort of testimonies of pain being discounted in racial context. I wasn't sure that I quite got the kind of connection there. So if you could say more about that, that would help.
Sure. So there is a sense in which this research project is still reasonably embryonic, but separate to the challenges, which if one forgets about philosophy completely, we could notionally take Fricker's testimonial injustice to be sort of identifying. And I'm both not against that, but also weary of Fricker for all sorts of reasons. Okay, with that point made, there are all sorts of people, not just Black, who experience testimonial challenges, the challenges of being taken seriously in medical healthcare. So there are some structural epistemic issues in the way medicine approaches pain, which have, and now it becomes more philosophical, epistemological parameters. But philosophical approaches to pain at the moment are predicated on concepts of rigor that also preclude and foreclose against the types of, and here I want to distinguish between knowledge and insight. So let's say insight that may well be gained from something, and this is where Elaine Scarry's body and pain conversation becomes hugely interesting, not least because, for example, of the ways in which she discusses pain as being necessarily unshareable. And her discussion is not the only one of the ways in which pain, will, this is my way of putting it, it will not domesticate itself, both to language in terms of its expression, but then it will also not domesticate itself to language in terms of ways in which we might talk about that which in some ways is notionally non-linguistic, create even more problems. And obviously Grahek's disavowal of the objectivist and the subjectivist for a type of epistemological and epistemic rigor that will take, very much following Searle, but also Dennett, these very mechanistic, very materialist ways of thinking about viable knowledge at these interstices of philosophy and science. It's impossible to see how any of that at the gate can actually help a philosophical conversation about pain. But a philosophical conversation about pain needs to happen that doesn't, and this is where I'm pushing back against the bad faith element of CRT, notionally assume that on a simplistic level, all we got to do is just take the lived experiences of people of color seriously, and then we're good. how can we critique even those enterprises which purport to be emancipatory on behalf of those whose testimonies vis-a-vis pain are not being taken seriously when they themselves may be part of the problem. So there's a lot of layers going on, because I take philosophical responsibility here as a Black academic, but also as a human being, to avoid the kinds of calumnies which say, simply by taking an apathetic view of what philosophy, etc., does, and doing not that, we have now solved our problems. This is effectively what CRT is doing. It's clear it hasn't succeeded. And at this moment, rather than simply saying that it hasn't, I'm doing my best to see how we can understand differently the reason or some reasons why a philosophical conversation about pain has got to take even CRT as part of the enemy rather than as an ally on its own journey to finding ways to offer accounts of how we might understand people's pain and offer accounts of how we might better articulate people's experiences of their pain than appears to be the case at present. Thanks for the question.
I'll be up to you. Okay, so James. No,
Okay, very good, Alexander, thank you. I do want to chime in just as a clinician to suggest that in an acute setting, pain
probably do it, but we'll keep it.
Okay, thanks. Anyway, pain can be assessed physiologically. Tachycardia or high heart rate, high blood pressure, sweating, agitation, dilated pupils, etc. So, in some fashion, but I understand the metaphorical aspect and the general direction of the discussion, but I'm curious. I'm because there seems to be always a counterexample in situations like this where the narrative of pain is one aspect of this, and if one were to attend to the narrative of pain, it might contribute to a further narrative of suffering. And the example would be to treat pain in an acute setting and continue to treat pain in an acute setting until somebody becomes an addict and then has to suffer through addiction and either withdrawal or continued socio-political complications of being addicted. How do you parse that, or how would you and the authors that you're speaking of address that issue, do you think?
I mean, that's suffering, I think, is part, thank you for the question, of why I am motivated to argue for a bad faith framing of not just CRT, but of racism itself. And in some ways, part of my use of bad faith is because, so how do we do this with time on the clock? This sort of an example, rather, of an easy cop bullet point pseudo summary of bad faith tends to be something along the lines of one has deceived oneself. That's obviously not clever. So if you basically be a good person and don't engage in self-deception, or be a wise person or an intelligent, and now it gets complicated, if you can avoid self-deception, then you've avoided bad faith, job's a good one. Okay. Then there's a sense that bad faith has something to do with freedom, but that's slightly more complicated, so then that gets hived off. Julius Bailey is really interested in the ways in which the aspect that Sartre has in mind of bad faith that is specific to a person having the means to understand quote unquote truth, but choosing to use their agency, but then he's not using the Frankfurt School agency, he's using freedom, which of course is contested. Does he understand freedom? That people choose to, amongst other things, deny racism isn't just something that Julius Bailey is identifying. It's actually that Sartre identifies in his work, and there's a whole collection called Racism After Sartre. Racism is an example of a calumny that Sartre takes to only come as a consequence of mauvais foi. Sidestep. You mentioned, I think your questions are actually linked, Jim, because the extent to which we can take ourselves to be legitimately, navigating biomedical markers of pain that we might argue are not dependent on patient testimony, are of course still governed by presuppositions in which in the end there are more questions than answers. And that I am obviously not against the medical guild or against empirical wisdom, far from it. But it's at that moment where a person's potential inability to articulate less the perspective ontogeny, if you will, of their pain, but the qualitative dimensions of their suffering will almost always get crunched in multiple epistemic lenses, which almost all of which being unregulated are assuming multiple sets of criteria for the possibility of knowledge and insight. And so arguably suffering is guaranteed because now the mechanisms by which a phenomenon that we can genuinely characterize in language and refer to as suffering becomes very much easier to refer to than to articulate multiple accounts of. So I'm interested in ways in which the questions we're trying to ask her about pain have consequences for all sorts of other conversations that people suffer in ways not adequately acknowledged by the epistemic mechanisms we use in all these conversations, philosophy included, would absolutely be one of those emancipatory concerns I have.
Great, I think one more question.
Yeah, so just one quick question. You mentioned many notions from feminist philosophy of science. So I was wondering if you tried to somehow add this context of discussions in the feminist philosophy of science about the woman's pain, and especially in the context of endometriosis and the changes in diagnostic and treatment practices that came with the understanding that there is a huge probability that the woman that is saying for already 30 years that is having a pain, now after those 30 years already started to be acknowledged that she is not crazy, right? So I think this is a very interesting discussion in this particular context that could be mentioned.
I mean, there is thank you so much for the question. Intersectionality is huge. And some of the interlocutors to whom I referred, not least in treatments or rather explications and accounts of critical race theory, part of what some of them are about is assuming that CRT can, does, should speak on behalf of more than just quote unquote race. Now, I'm not sure that some of those desires to widen necessary epistemic experiences do anything other than muddy waters, not least because we can create new lenses for new problems. But there is a sense in which part of why I come back to race without beginning to disavow any of this. I have a colleague here at King's, Sarah Milton. I'm calling her name, but it's all good. Her project has involved research with Black and brown moms in maternity wards. And one of the things that Sarah has talked about is the fact that her research collaborators consistently tell her, as Black and brown mums, in maternity wards, that they consistently watch, I know I've used that word twice, white mums receiving a vastly higher and seemingly more compassionate level of pain management than they do. So we have the mad situation where it is, of course, as you say, the feminine, and I see that totally non-pejoratively, but and also non-politically, dimensions of these conversations have by being taken more seriously, have indeed resulted in better outcomes. But it is an absolute train wreck of an ethical situation that some of these better outcomes remain unexperienced by people when the markers change beyond sex and gender to. So even that is a way, I think, of acknowledging that we have made progress, whilst also shining a light on the fact that we have a scary amount of work still to do.
Up here or
It's okay, they're very lucky. Thank you for asking. Kings have employed some people who will.
okay.
And I feel that very.
Today, I'm going to say it today. Wait, do you want to say something? No, wait, no, I'm not. That thing's still working?
Why don't this one?
Yes.
Well, thank you to the online audience for joining. So you are warmly invited to the pub as well, but we won't be carrying a computer. So, have a drink in privacy. Everyone else. So I think Rivka, you walk people to Lyceum pub, is that right? I sadly need to do a few emails, so I will follow later. Don't wait for me. And then Rivka will also guide us from the pub to dinner. And so I want to thank everyone for a really great day and a wonderful series of talks. Thank you very much.